So this is what you could call an emergency recording. People that have podcasts, they'll say the emergency pod, the emergency podcast. You may have noticed I don't like to use that word. I like to just use words like recording. So this is an emergency recording. What's the emergency? The emergency is today's Hayom Yom. I wasn't planning ahead in terms of Hayom Yom. Obviously, I've always had the idea that maybe if there's an interesting Hayom Yom, it would be something to use as a basis to elaborate on. But in this case, that wasn't my intention, my plan, my mindset. But today is indeed, Yud Dal Tammuz is indeed, you could say perhaps the most infamous Hayom Yom. Every year, at least the people that I know, every year when this Hayom Yom comes around, everyone starts koching and tumbling, fundas nai, all over again. What's pshat on the Hayom Yom? What's going on with the Hayom Yom? And so people got on my case and they said, you should really record something about the Hayom Yom. Now, sometimes I like to talk off the cuff. Sometimes I like to prepare. Usually when I prepare, I have a file. But in this case, it's somewhere nishtahen, nishtaher. So I have right in front of me right now, I have 20 papers printed out, combine makairos and sources. I would like to make a bit of a seder with regard to this Hayom Yom, but at the same time, no promise, no guarantee that this is a davar hashalem, because it is a bit off the cuff. I did once speak about the topic of America in the writings of the rebbeim a summer or two ago, but I don't think I have notes from that. I think it was also printouts. So at any rate, let's jump into this Hayom Yom. The Hayom Yom, famously Yudal Tammuz, Zel Shoin Hatzemach Tzedek Be'echad Midrusha, which itself l'chayr is a shtickl chiddush. Almost all the Hayom Yoms are shticklach from the Frierdiker Rebbe. Sometimes it's just hayrois or tikkunim in the Kutatera, but otherwise the teichendik nyanim l'chayr are all from the Frierdiker Rebbe. And here l'chayr it's straight from the Tzemach Tzedek, which is unusual. Although we'll see how the Rebbe was mitzayim. We have a copy of the Rebbe's Hayom Yom where the Rebbe was mitzayim the makairos in the margins, and we'll see that technically this also counts as quoting from the Frierdiker Rebbe. But that's not overtly in the text. The text says, Zelashain Hatzemach Tzedek Ve'echad Medrushav, Rabbeinu Zal ben Breisav Lubanov, Yom Gimel Parshas Balak Shnas Tavkov Samach Beis, Omar V'zeh Dvarov, Lahavin Kushis HaToichne, Me'achar She'adati Kaduris V'agula K'tapuach, Lama Einam Neuflim Oisem B'nei Adam Hadonim Kinegdeinu Milamato Be'America. So this question of why do people in America not fall off the globe? V'terutzim Einei Emes, Rabbeinu Zal Omar Ki Ateretzu, Mavur, Beitz Chaim, Galgalim, Igulim. Eagle doesn't have Maya Lomata, so they're not really Lamata. The Rakia Shaleim is Lamaila Bashva Achasim Rakia Shalenu, Ba'aris Hashem Himata Lagabi Rakia Shaleha. So this is the Hayom Yom, very cryptic. Every year, the tumbling usually focuses on the question of, so is Hayom Yom agreeing with gravity? Is it not agreeing with gravity? What exactly is the scientific context for the Hayom Yom? Which sources was the Alter Rebbe referring to, etc., etc. So that's the annual tumult. In my opinion, that's kind of perhaps the less interesting part of the Hayom Yom. And what's interesting about the Hayom Yom is the part that's not there overtly. It's between the lines, but there's a lot going on there. And that's mainly what I want to get to, but we'll also cover some of the other points and aspects as well, of Fianios Daiti. So what I believe really is that the Nakuda of this Hayom Yom is really about America. It's not about gravity. I know if you ask people, you took a poll, you took a survey to ask people to summarize the Teichen of the Hayom Yom in one word, I think many would say gravity. That's what the conversations seem to revolve around. But in my opinion, if you had to summarize the Hayom Yom in one word, the word would be America. And that's the reason why it's in the Hayom Yom. That's the reason why it's in the source that the Rebbe got it from, which, as I alluded to, is really from the Frierdiker Rebbe, quoting the Tzemach Tzedek, quoting the Alter Rebbe. That was why the Frierdiker Rebbe was discussing it. And as we'll see, there was sort of this larger, invisible discussion about America in Chabad, based on Chabad makairos, looking at the Alter Rebbe's Titus, and a discussion that we see explicitly from the Rebbe Rashab and on, the Rashab, the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rebbe, all discussing the place, the role, the meaning, the significance of America. And we'll see that it wasn't just a theoretical question, it was almost a practical question, a practical hashkafa question. And in fact, part of that question has to do with another part of that same Torah of the Alter Rebbe that you may have heard of in a completely different form without realizing that it's actually from the same Torah. And this Hayom Yom is emphasizing this part of that Torah instead of that part of that Torah. So I don't know if that makes sense if you don't know what I'm about to say, but that's to give you an indication that there's a lot going on here beneath the surface. Where to begin? So I guess let's begin with the place of America in Jewish history, right? So obviously, as far as we know, America was discovered in 1492 by Columbus. Of course, every part of that sentence you could probably quibble with, but we're going to keep it simple. On that front, there's always the question of whether some had discovered it earlier, some were aware of it earlier. Are there places mentioned in the Torah, mentioned in Tanakh, that are really on the American continent? I personally don't think that's a reasonable pshat in the psukim, the things the Torah says, Tanakh says. But people have entertained that idea ever since America has been discovered. But obviously, the discovery of America is a singular event in world history in the sense of there being pretty much a known world, although even the known world probably didn't extend all the way through China, Japan. If you're speaking from a Western perspective, the knowledge of how far the continent extended probably ended in a blur somewhere between India and China, which is another discussion. But at any rate, they were aware broadly of the continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa, at least parts of them. So for there to be an entire comparable landmass on the other side of the globe, which itself people sometimes debate and argue how widespread, how clearly people knew, believed, understood that the world is a globe and that there could be Earth on the other end. It's not clear. It's hard to speak for everyone. There probably were many layers, degrees of knowledge. It was not very uniform and standardized back in the day. That's even within one country itself, never mind from country to country, culture to culture, era to era, different levels of knowledge and intelligence within different groups. So at any rate, the discovery of the landmass of America was certainly a singular chidush and discovery. So the question is, how did Yiddishkeit, how do our sources react to it? Now, of course, the involvement of Jews, especially Frumme Jews, Hamish Jews, also took quite a while, and it's a topic I'm also always interested in. We know there was a Kehillah in Recife in Brazil at a pretty early point for a short amount of time, and they actually sent over some Chashav Rabbanim, which is interesting because in the future, when Jews came, they were not accompanied by Chashav Rabbanim, but that first attempt did have some Chashav Rabbanim. It was like a satellite of the Kehillah in Amsterdam, who generally we find in the early Doiros, the Sephardic communities in Amsterdam and later in London were at the forefront of settling the American continent due to the fact that both the Dutch and the English were both very heavily involved in whatever the term would be, colonizing or occupying or settling the continent. We know, of course, New York itself changed hands between the Dutch and the English, but the Sephardim, punct or not, maybe it's not coincidental, but the Western Sephardim were located in those lands. So wherever the Dutch went, the Western Sephardim of the Netherlands went as well, and wherever the British went, the Western Sephardim of London went as well. So those are often the Jews you hear about, but it is a little bit more interesting than that. There were some Ashkenazim as well. In some cases, the Sephardim themselves had belonged to a Sephardic community in Poland. There were some Sephardic outposts in Poland along the way, and some of the early Jews in America had that background. Although it's unclear how much of a impact being in Poland had on them, how Hamish we could consider them by the metric, the barometer of Hamish. So at any rate, this is a larger, interesting topic, the history of the connection between Jews and America. But beyond that, going back to, like I said, this is a bit of a Ashkenazi-centric or even more Eastern European, Poland, Russia, Hasidic-centric discussion. So from that perspective, to what extent was America known? Was it thought about, discussed? How was America seen? Was it seen as, you could move from Poland to Italy? Jews moved around, even Ashkenazi Polish Jews moved around Europe. They would travel to Eretz Yisrael, to the Middle East. They would end up in Amsterdam. They would end up in London. There was definitely a large sphere in which Jews could move around, and Jews would consider a space that they may find themselves migrating to, no matter how small their percentages were. But did they see America the same way, or was America seen as just this perhaps freakish entity that's a no-go zone? These are questions to consider, and it's relevant to the upcoming discussion. It's interesting to note that I've encountered in the past that some have suggested that we can identify the first sefer to mention the discovery of America. There was someone by the name of Avraham Farasol. In Hebrew, the name is spelled, if you read it Yeshivish, it looks like his name is Avram Pritzel, but apparently the correct pronunciation is Farasol. And he wrote some Pirushim on parts of Tanakh. Tzemach Tzedek quotes his Pirushim in some places because they were printed on the daf of the Mekreis Gedolos of his day. And he also he wrote various Chiburim. He had a strong interest in geography. So some scholars have suggested that Farasol's Pirush to Iyov, which was actually included in that Tanakh that I just mentioned, the Bamberg edition of Tanakh with Mefarshim in Venice, contained Farasol's Pirush to Iyov. And it's possible that this Pirush contains the earliest reference to the New World in Hebrew literature and Jewish literature. Farasol writes, Ulam Hayom Azen Esparsim Tzenu Rechav Yishuv Gadol Asher B'tzad Hadroimi Holam En Amashva Hayom V'cheim B'Ktzais HaMizrach Shnes Yashav Harbe Asher Lahem Orim Choshech Kayetz Im Chayrev B'Zman Mischalef etc. V'chol Zeh Mavur La'anshei Chochmas HaKosmografia V'HaTechuna. So he was Farasol being one of the Italian Jews who were Oisik and Chochmas, which was a strong tradition in Italy among Italian Jews. So and often we find that the Italian Jews living through the Renaissance not only were interested in Chochmas and the classic Chochmas, the classic early Greek sources, but they were up to date. They took a great interest in the latest discoveries, the latest ideas, and there are many interesting chiburim from Chachmei Italia from the 1500s and on, or perhaps even the 1400s and on, in which you see their strong engagement with the ideas and the Chachmas and Afka, the latest knowledge, the latest ideas. So it's perhaps not surprising that someone like Farasol, who was a Chacham in Italy and was Isaac in particular in geography, this was a topic that was of strong interest to him. Today, of course, you have to just, again, appreciate that today geography could be something you could have a loose grasp on, but your grasp of geography is still shaloi be'arech compared to what the average person could have understood and grasped hundreds of years ago. So the expert on geography 500 years ago's ideas might be lesser than ours, but compared to the effort that it took and the knowledge and the skill to acquire, to understand this, the person would be considered a big chacham in geography. So he was one such chacham, and he's the one who, and you could see that he's like emphasizing that they have the same Oren Choshech, they have the same Kayetz Chayrev. Clearly, the notion of there being a new continent on the other side of the world was sort of a mind-bending idea, and that is also important to realize and understand when we get back to the Alter Rebbe. The notion that everything's the same there, that the same norms that we're familiar with is there. We see, of course, in Chazal, there's the question of where do the sun and the moon go at night. So that hadn't necessarily been fully resolved in people's minds. Today, obviously, however you teach the Gemaras, everyone sort of understands that the sun, or however you want to describe it, the sun is turning, the earth is turning, without getting into that. But in common perception, the sun revolves around the earth, and you have the cycle of day and night, and it's completely consistent. Certainly around the equator. Obviously, once you go to the north and south poles, it's the experience there is a bit different. But certainly around the equator, the experience is identical in every place. So this wouldn't have been a basic fact to most people, presumably 500 years ago. So you had to emphasize and say, actually, the sun is rising and setting in the same way, and the seasons are switching in the same way. This was all a chiddush. You had to say so. You had to confirm that this was so, or else people wouldn't necessarily assume that. People might assume, who knows, about what's going on the other side of the earth. So the other side of the earth, maybe think about it as what if we have some Akaitis, it's mentioned in Zohar, whatever the pshat is, that there may be nether worlds, right? But no, beneath the surface, there may be another earth, another level, just like in games today, video games, you can imagine levels. So imagine the earth has multiple levels and layers and peels within it. Imagine you heard that there was another existence, another place where people lived beneath the Earth's surface. You would immediately ask, wait a second, do they have light? Do they have a day? Do they have a night? Do they have seasons? You wouldn't assume that they're in the same ecosystem as us. So it would seem that the average person at the time of the discovery of America, and even perhaps for those in Eastern Europe, those not exposed to the New Yiddish and Chachmas, even as late as the Alter Rebbe, people would likely be assuming that this other side of the earth is some kind of netherworld, and who knows what's going on there. It would take time for people to fully realize and appreciate that essentially what we know today, that living on one side of the earth feels exactly the same as living on the other side of the earth, and there would be no difference, no distinction. So you could see it even in Farah Sol's presentation. The quote I was quoting before is a bit bekitzer. I also have the original quote in front of me, and it's the barichas that the sun revolves. Kol yom v'yom chavdal shoyes yud beishoyes mehem or yom yud beishoyes mehem choshech. And there are places like at the poles where they have 6 straight months. So that's so that was very important to emphasize at the time. After that, it's not clear how many times America is mentioned in Stam Svarim. Not that much. I think I once tried searching, but it's always tricky, and the older the Svarim are, it's harder to rely on the text search. But I wouldn't assume if between Farah Sol and the Alter Rebbe there were more than a dozen mentions of America in Svarim written by rabbinic figures, I would be surprised. I'm not even sure if we have that. I can't even name one, but I'm going to assume there's at least one or two, and there are probably other Italian Svarim. That would be the most likely place to look. Other Italian Svarim that may mention it, you have the Sefer Shulte Giborim on Inyonei Beis Hamikdash. That's the kind of Sefer that might mention America somewhere in there, maybe when talking about the spices, and you'll say that the spices come from America, something like that. But otherwise, America, because it's not overtly mentioned anywhere in the Tanakh and Torah sources, so it didn't really have a Torah context, a rabbinic context, so why would you mention it? And then there weren't really Jews there, or not in a significant number. So obviously, like I said, there was a community there, and obviously those who were there, or those in Amsterdam interacting with them, obviously probably made reference to the fact that they're co-religionists, their family members are across the ocean on this new continent. But otherwise, there wouldn't have been too many reasons. It wouldn't come up in standard, certainly not in discussion of Gemara, Halacha, even in Drush. I don't know how many would mention it. It would pass for Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz maybe to mention it in his Drush somewhere. I don't know if he does. But he also mentions interesting scientific stuff for his time. So maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. So at any rate, there's not much going on. So this is all sort of important context to keep in mind when you think about the fact that in Tavkuf Samach Beis, when the Alter Rebbe is speaking to his children, in Beroisav Levanov, speaking to his children, Yom Gimel, Parshas Balak, Shnas Tavkuf Samach Beis, that the Alter Rebbe is talking about America. Now, I think, I didn't have a chance to go check it, but I think Bechlal, when the Alter Rebbe was arrested, so today there's a certain sort of a standardized story of the Alter Rebbe's arrest. You have the version of Beis Rebbe, you have from the Frierdiker Rebbe. So the standardized story that is told, that is taught to children. Then there's another layer after they discovered the files from Alter Rebbe's arrest. So then you could have a more scholarly, footnoted version of the story of the Alter Rebbe's arrest. But really, there's an earlier version of the story of the Alter Rebbe's arrest, and a version of that was printed by a fellow character by the name of Rodkinson. We're not going to get into that. But before Beis Rebbe, the first work, I suppose, to serve as a shtickle biography or to contain the stories of the Alter Rebbe. I don't want to make such a blanket statement because you have other stuff. You have Sipurim Ne'roim, and then I think there was a weird publication, Meiser Rebbe Zalmina, which I'm going to get to in a second, that may have been printed earlier. But the Rodkinson was certainly, when the history of Chabad historiography is written, Rodkinson is often sort of there at the beginning. And the stories that he printed about the Alter Rebbe were a bit more fanciful. And we find that among the Oila, among the Stam, the Welt, there were a lot of very fanciful, exciting stories about the Alter Rebbe and the adventures that he had in prison, and his interactions with the king, and how the king brought him and he impressed the king and all the Chachmas. This was sort of the tone, the tenor, the nature of the stories that were being told. Interestingly, we just saw an interesting mucker corroboration for these types of stories, because just in the last few months, Machon Ahavat Shalom, in their new volume of Minhag Nozim, printed a document from Morocco from around the year 1800, maybe a bit 1800, 1810, where some Ashkenazi from Eastern Europe came to Morocco, and he was trying to describe to them life in Eastern Europe, and it's very interesting and somewhat humorous in parts. And at one point, he gets to the story of the Chassidim, and he tells them that there's two big rabbis, there's Reb Zalman and Reb Baruch, and they don't get along. And I think at some point, it mentions Bekitza that Reb Zalman was arrested, and then he impressed the king with all the Chachmas, and then he was freed. That's sort of the Cliff Notes version, the short summary that this fellow is trying to convey to the Jews in Morocco, and the person in Morocco is dutifully writing it down. So that's how he sums it up, and that, I think, is a very good representation of how the story was perceived and told at the time, and that sort of got de-emphasized with time. It's presumably historically not necessarily so accurate and true. And in the official Chabad story, there is some interaction with the king, perhaps, but it's to a much lesser degree. But in the early Mekairis, there's a lot of, and one of these early sources is this Meiser Rebbe Zalmina that Munsheim printed in Kerem Chabad 4. I think he reproduced the actual original pages. I don't remember when it was printed, but it represents this very fanciful version of that story. And I think this is whole barichas. I'm hoping it's my memory, my recollection is taka true, that in there may be something about how they showed the Alter Rebbe the map of the world, and specifically the map of America, and the Alter Rebbe told them that they made a mistake, that there's a mistake in the drawing, in the cartography, relating to the boundaries of America. I'm hoping that it's related to America, otherwise this is all irrelevant. But that may be another interesting source, a little out of the box, that also ties the Alter Rebbe to thinking about, being interested in, having some connection to America. So, as I said, America was not seen as a destination, as a haven for Ashkenazi Jews, certainly not for Eastern European Jews. There may have been one Ashkenazi or two who ended up in America, but they probably also had first been there by way of Amsterdam or London, and had also crossed over. Whereas a Yid living in Poland, a Yid living in Russia, even if they were adventurous, even if they're going to travel to Königsberg or even further, I don't think America was a realistic place for them. And I don't think there were any Yedias reports. There were no Hebrew newspapers yet at the time. So there was no conduit, there was no real means for information about America to really reach them. I'm sure those who were Isaac in trade were a little more knowledgeable. It's possible that they could have heard more. I'm sure people may have been talking about it, chatting about it in the inns, in the taverns, and depending on their exposure to the wider world, what they were saying may have had some basis in truth or not. But there was probably very little to go by, and it was just still this very far off, mysterious, almost netherworld type of region. So I think that's all relevant to understanding the context here. So if you look at the Alter Rebbe's Torah, which is in fact, now that we have a set of Mamori Admar Azakin, so you have in Mamori Admar Azakin Tov Kosamach Beis Chelik Aleph at the end, page Reish Tzaddik Gimel, they have Lahav and Kushas HaToichna. Then in Chelik Beis, they have two versions of it. On page Taf Ayin Hey, there's Toila Eretz Al Belima, which I believe is the Alter Rebbe's version, because Alter Rebbe's Torahs were often written by more than one person. So there's Toila Eretz Al Belima, and then there is Lahav and Kushas HaToichna, which is the second Nusach, page Taf Ayin Zayin onward. So just the way it starts, when it says Lahavin, the fact that the people in America, they're not falling off, I think that itself could sort of represent what the type of discourse would have been. If you were sitting in a shtetl and you were talking about America, you were probably trying to just wrap your mind around that fact, not from some sophisticated place necessarily, but just on a basic level. Like, how is it? What's pshat? What's going on? Like, you would imagine them, you would picture them as sort of walking upside down, which would be very strange to you. That, I think, is the basic context that one should be keeping in mind when considering this discussion. Interestingly, I'll point out that around this time, or starting just a bit afterwards, or even just a bit before, there was the winds of modernization were arriving. You had maskilim, although that term isn't always such a helpful term, but you had people that were more enlightened, more ifgeklert, first in Western Europe and then spreading into Eastern Europe. And starting from around then already, we start seeing new Hebrew literature, meaning you start thinking about, if you think about Ivrit, you think about modern Hebrew literature. If you're thinking 1900s, you're thinking way too late. The beginnings of modern Hebrew literature began in the late 1700s. There was a journal called Hama'asef that is, I think, the 1780s perhaps, and other publications of a similar nature. There was Bikuri Itim, and then other just books that were being printed that you wouldn't know about unless you went searching for them, or you went searching for the academic articles that survey this body of literature. So at any rate, what's interesting is that if you actually look for mentions of America in Hebrew literature at the time, you're not going to find much in the standard rabbinic works, at least I haven't found, but you will notice that there is a disproportionate emphasis on America in these writings. So Hama'asif itself mentions America. Hama'asif itself mentions the American Revolution. It may be the first Hebrew instance referencing the American Revolution, which was also in Alter Rebbe's time, the Alter Rebbe's era, but it's unclear what the people in Eastern Europe would have heard about it, especially if they didn't have a regular source of news yet at that time. There were newspapers in Western Europe, but not necessarily in Eastern Europe, or not ones that they could read. So Hama'asif may be the first source that mentions the American Revolution and other events, other military events that were taking place on the American continent. I believe I saw a mention in Hama'asif about the siege of Gibraltar, which was 1779 to 1783. So there was a bit of an up-to-date awareness of current events in America going on, at least in Hama'asif, but that would be that probably wouldn't represent what Hamish Frume Yidden, Chassidish Yidden in Eastern Europe were reading. And then we find afterwards that some of the earliest modern Hebrew literature, and again, we're talking very early 1800s, had to do with the discovery of America. There were Hebrew translations. There was a popular book at the time that sort of recounted the tale of the discovery of America. And many early maskilim, it seems, tried their hand at translating it into Hebrew. It seems like there were multiple translations. One of the translations actually is from members of the Horowitz family in Uman, who are famous for the fact that Reb Nachman of Breslov was very friendly with them when he moved to Uman. Very famously, he was friendly with the big maskilim there. And so a couple of years later, it seems that they were involved in translating works like this, either into Hebrew or even into Yiddish. So this was why were they translating that? There could be various reasons. Partially, it would just be sort of introducing a certain style of literature into the Hebrew writing and reading world that hadn't been there. But perhaps there's also something specific about America, and that's new, it's modern, it's different. And perhaps that itself could be considered somewhat dangerous knowledge and information, or transgressive, or eye-opening, mind-opening. So that's interesting to note as well. One other source that's important that we'll mention a bit later is the Sefer Habris, which is in its own interesting category in that it's sort of externally Haskalah coded, but the author did not identify as a maskil by any means and was sort of in his own lane. And there's the question of whether the Alter Rebbe would have seen his work and been reacting to his work. But that, I think, concludes the first section, first point I wanted to discuss and cover, which is sort of the historical and sociological context for what a discussion of America would even mean at that time. That's the first point. That's the first part. The second part is the physics. What is the Alter Rebbe actually saying there? So first of all, it's probably worth mentioning that it really requires the amount of knowledge that's necessary, the requisite knowledge that would be required to be able to have an intelligent discussion about the Hayom Yom would entail not just understanding physics today, but also understanding the history of physics, the history of how this was understood, and also being able to have a clear-eyed and accurate view as to what the Alter Rebbe logically would have been knowledgeable in, what he would know about, what he wouldn't know about. Often people seem to be motivated to attribute Alter Rebbe is responding to Newton, he's predating Einstein. I don't think that's a grounded historical approach. It's much more likely that Alter Rebbe would be aware of much earlier classical Jewish works that were based on medieval or ancient Greek knowledge. There's no evidence that Alter Rebbe would stamazoi be up to date even with Newton, even if Newton had already expressed some ideas of gravity prior to the Alter Rebbe speaking at this time. It would seem unreasonable to me, for instance, to think that Alter Rebbe would be aware of Newton. So you sort of need to have that type of knowledge. I would say that I'm somewhat stronger in the historical context and somewhat weaker in the actual grasp of the actual subject. So that's a bit tricky. It's a bit hard to have an opinion on something without fully grasping the modern physics and the ancient physics. But I still think, I still have, for better or worse, I still do have an opinion about what I think is happening with the Alter Rebbe. And the way I have understood the Alter Rebbe, and this has come up in previous cycles of this discussion in previous years, people sort of get caught up on the Alter Rebbe expressing, the Alter Rebbe sort of sets up the classic explanation versus his explanation. The classic explanation is that it's Yesod Offer, and the Alter Rebbe's teretz is that it's Igulim. First of all, I saw that someone pointed out that even the concept of Igulim is also Aristotelian, meaning both the terms of Yesodist and Yesod Offer would be sort of a classic Aristotelian explanation, but the notion of Igulim would also be Aristotelian. Maybe we'll get back to that. So it's unclear how much, whether it's necessary to involve any later, more modern scientific sources and notions. But I think if we put ourselves in the mindset of Alter Rebbe, Yidden, and the Shtetl, I think we can sort of simplify what is going on here, and it doesn't really have so much to do with physics or the question of gravity and what's the cause of the pull, etc. so much as it's about just a larger conceptual point. The way I understand it is that the average person, like I said, as I mentioned earlier, average person would sort of be thinking of the other half of the world as sort of being upside down. Where they live, the earth is below and the sky is above. And if they were to somehow try to picture the globe and the sky, they would just sort of picture the earth being up and the sky being down on the other side of the globe. It's just upside down, topsy-turvy land. With that assumption, the question would now be, why don't they fall down? So you're going to come and tell me, you say the offer, you're going to come and tell me modern versions of it, gravity, this, that, a hair. Even using terms like gravity wouldn't be addressing the underlying question, the underlying problem, which is they're all upside down. They're literally walking upside down, their feet are up, their heads are down, the earth is up, the sky is down. And that itself, so let's say you use the model of Yesod the offer. So Yesod the offer pulls things, so that's a hesber for why we, who walk normally with our heads up and our feet down, we see that you throw an object up, the object doesn't just float away, it ultimately lands back down on the earth. And we don't float away, we walk on the earth. So you say the offer were drawn down. So the Aish is up and offer is down. So the sky is up. Our heads are closer to the sky. The earth is down. Our feet are closer to the ground. And you say the offer is pulling things to it. You want to say it's gravity instead of you say the offer. Okay, fine. Number Zagan. But that all sort of makes sense in this context here. But you're talking about the other side of the earth where they're all upside down. That would first of all mean that the Yesod offer has to be working way harder on the other side of the earth. The Yesod offer is a minimum work. Ultimately, down is down and up is up. So, and Yesod offer tends to gravitate down, so it ends up down. But there, Yesod offer is up, and it has to be pulling things up. The amount of strength, the amount of pull that would be needed would be 2 times more, 5 times more, 10 times more. That's how I think. I think that they would be approaching it, processing it, trying to understand it. And what the Alter Rebbe is saying, essentially, in his teretz is like, no, you have to change your entire understanding, your entire framework, which would be hard for your average person in the shtetl. It may have been something that Aristotle already understood. The Rambam does also seem to sort of express this point right in the beginning of Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, that you have to view the earth as the center instead of thinking of up and down. It's the earth is the center of the universe, and everything expands outwards concentrically from there. So it's not quite the way you would assume. But how many people read that, understood that, internalized that? So the Alter Rebbe is trying to emphasize this point. He's using Kabbalistic terminology, the terminology of Igulim, and he's fitting it into that framework, which, again, someone pointed out that understanding it this way, or even using terms like Igulim, could also be Aristotelian in nature. I'm not sure. I'm not qualified to say whether Aristotle combined these 2 points or emphasized these 2 points or emphasized that there is no other side of the earth, the other side of the earth isn't upside down. I don't know if Aristotle got that far in how he expressed it. At any rate, I don't think the Alter Rebbe is here to be mechadish anything in physics. I don't think that's how we should be measuring the value of what the Alter Rebbe is saying. I think the value is, A, in the context, the audience, and trying to understand the earth and trying to understand the realities now of people in America, and fitting it into a Kabbalistic framework, which the Alter Rebbe did in other places as well. Even on this occasion, we see that the Alter Rebbe also separately or behemshech spoke about the weather, explaining sort of the weather according to a similar type of framework. So this was something that the Alter Rebbe was known to do. Bechlal, I was going to mention it somewhere, I guess I'll mention it here, that Bechlal is a whole genre of the Alter Rebbe, sort of, it's really sichus schmoozing with his children. Here it's the most explicit, because it says, Imrois of Levanov makes it clear that it's not a Torah, not a mimer in the classical sense. So often it's called Dibra Maskul Havin Kushas HaTorah. The mimer of the Alter Rebbe, mimer is sort of a misnomer. I've argued that this is really the case for a much larger percentage of the Alter Rebbe's Torah's sayings, teachings, printed in the set of Mamari Admor Azakim, and particularly those that begin with Lahavin Inyan, which this particular Torah, at least in one of the versions, begins Lahavin Kushas HaTorah. Typically that means it's not a drush. A drush has a certain context. You're getting up in front of an olam. It's in the tradition of drushes that were given before, each generation giving its own take on it. So the Alter Rebbe's Mamarim should be understood in the context of the history of drush. Whereas these are just conversations, in my opinion, my estimation. Again, here it's the most explicit, where it says Imrois of Levanov, both in the Ksav Yad and how it's copied in the Hayom Yom. So there are many such interesting conversations. If you look through all the Alter Rebbe's Lahavin Inyans and you look for those that touch on science, you'll see that it's a genre, a subgenre within the Lahavin Inyans. So that's the correct framework, in my opinion, to understanding and approaching what Alter Rebbe is saying here. And I think the main point that Alter Rebbe was trying to explain is that don't look to gravity, don't look to, again, probably not gravity, but the ancient version of gravity, could be the classic Greek version of gravity. Don't look to that as like a teretz as to why they're upside down and yet they don't fall. You have to change your entire Havana, which is that fundamentally there is no difference. For the people there, the sky is above them and the earth is below them just as much as it is for us here. So you're not really asking so much why we're not falling off the earth. So just as you don't ask why people here don't fall off the earth, there is no unique question with regard to the people there. The second you think it's unique to the people there, then you're approaching the entire subject incorrectly. That, I think, is purely the point of the Alter Rebbe. So, is there a Koyach HaMashiach? I don't think the Alter Rebbe is coming to be shoylel a Koyach HaMashiach. I think the Alter Rebbe is saying that if you take Koyach HaMashiach to be the explanation as to why they're upside down and yet they don't fall, then it's not a good teretz. But, so people, often the top question people ask is, the Alter Rebbe saying there is gravity, there isn't gravity. I don't think that's the question at all. The Chassidus and other places talks about zrika and things falling, but that's the premise there is that you're walking upright, and up is up and down is down. And again, the shaila there isn't down, up, and up, down, and Alter Rebbe is coming to say barichas that that's not the case. Especially if you look at the Makar, I think you'll see that is really the toichen, kol ha'arichas there to try to convey this point and to change people's havana. So imagine if that's the case, if people are still thinking in 1802 that the people in America are walking upside down, you can imagine how distant, how different, how othered America was at the time. And in that sense, the Alter Rebbe is trying to make America seem a bit more close, normal, relevant, relatable. And that's perhaps relevant to the next point, the next section of our discussion, the final section of our discussion as to the context, the Chassidish context to an attitude towards America in general. But again, to summarize, I don't think the Alter Rebbe is taking any, is not acknowledging, not interacting with any particular new chidushim in the tchum of physics, gravity and Kepler, Newton, ahin aher. I don't think that's necessary at all to the Havana here. And I don't think the Alter Rebbe, on the flip side, is the Alter Rebbe is not being shoylel gravity one way or the other. It's a point which may have been already understood and explained by Aristotle, mentioned by the Rambam, but hadn't been fully internalized, that there is no up and down, that within the system that the Earth exists in, all sides of the Earth are equally down, and the sky is equally up. And you see it even in the Kitzer in Hayom Yom, like that emphasis of that's Harakia Shaleim Hu Lamayla, Haaretz Desham Hi Mata. It's just explaining that up is just as up there and down is just as down there. So if you don't have a kasha here, you don't have a kasha there, but nothing to do with how Koyach HaMashiach works here any more than it works there. So that's my take on that. Whether or not that's going to put the annual discussions to bed, I don't know, but that's my take, which I think is probably the most sound, both in terms of actually engaging with the text and the scientific context, historical context, the local sociological context as to what people were actually thinking, what the Alter Rebbe would actually be saying. Maybe here's where I'll mention that someone pointed out that, interestingly, there's this work called the Sefer HaBris. The Sefer HaBris is from this character, Pinchas, now I'm not remembering if it's Pinchas ben Elio or Pinchas Elio ben something, but someone by the name of Pinchas Horowitz, I believe is the name. He lived in Vilna, but I think he traveled west. Maybe he came back. He wrote this entire work, which was striving to be an up-to-date Hebrew rabbinic work with up-to-date ideas, knowledge, science, and it's come up in previous shiurim. We once spoke about microscopic entities in the food. So even though the ability to see such entities occurred maybe 100, 200 years earlier, but the first sefer, I think, to mention it is the Sefer HaBris, for example, and he actually mentions the halachic shaila. So wait a second, if you look at the vinegar under a microscope and you see that it's moving, so then how can you eat the vinegar? These sort of modern shilas, but that took a long time to sort of arrive in the Hamisher world, the rabbinic world. So he was a bit of a pioneer in that way. So within the larger context, everyone else who was trying to convey new knowledge in Hebrew was a maskil. Pinchas Horowitz, though, based on what he writes in his Sefer itself, seems to really be in his own lane. It may be linked to the Gra's hashkafa. We know that the Gra in his circle had a bit of hashkafa about the importance of chachmas, and that's something that since we spoke recently about the Chabad view and chachmas, and we only touched parts of it, there's much more to it. Someone pointed out to me, another point to discuss would be to contrast what Alter Rebbe was saying versus what the Gra was supporting. The Fidik Rebbe describes that this interest in Chachmas in the Gra's circle ended up being helpful for the Maskilim to make inroads, and that those from Vilna who traveled to Berlin, Lishma, ended up being influenced by the winds of Eskal in Berlin. So it's very hard to separate the two. Interestingly, Rabbi Nuchem Greenwald wrote about the Sefer Habris in Heichal Habesht a few years ago. I thought I brought the copies with me here for this discussion. Now I'm not seeing it, but it's okay. Here it is. So I have here Heichal Habesht. Gilyon Lamed Zayin is from Choyref Tafshanayin Tes, and a follow-up in Gilyon Lamed Ches, Kayet Tafshanayin Tes. And there he writes about Sefer Bris, and a bit of the context, and a bit of his attitude to Chassidus, and a bit of the attitude of Chassidus to him. There isn't much in Chabad. The Tzemach Tzedek mentions him once or twice. The Frierdiker Rebbe mentions him once or twice. So in the second one, in the follow-up, he mentions that in one place the Frierdiker Rebbe is sort of giving this historical outline of Haskalah and Chachmas, and the way the Frierdiker Rebbe is telling the story of the Gros Circle. It's sort of another warning, just as we discussed in our recordings in Chachmas Chitzonius, that the Rebbe Rashab cited the Yisrael Salanter's experience as a warning. So the Frierdiker Rebbe is also zooming out and going a bit further back to refer to the Gros Circle as a warning as well. So apparently in that context, the Frierdiker Rebbe mentions Pinchas, the Baal Sefer Abris, and it's sort of in this overall negative context. So that would seem to be representative of what they would have thought about this in Chabad. However, it was pointed out that in Sefer Abris, there is in fact a chapter on this very question. B'chalal, he mentions America a lot. So speaking of America in rabbinic sources, so that's an important source. The Sefer was printed for the first time in the Tufkuf Nun, the 1790s. I remember that I think there were 2 editions, and the second edition had the additional material compared to the first one. I didn't go look the whole chronology up to confirm that he had written about America already in the first edition, and the Alter Rebbe could have seen it. There is this question as to whether the Alter Rebbe would have seen it, could have seen it, would have used it, would have been quoting from it. That's sort of why it's being mentioned and invoked. So he has this whole chapter there about America, and he gets a lot into gravity, and he seems to be describing more modern notions and versions of gravity. I would have to go back and see again if he emphasizes this nakuda that I was emphasizing just before, about that you have to understand that there's no difference in the Ma'ila Umata or not. But he was definitely focusing on and describing the mechanics, the way physics explains gravity in a much greater detail. And he definitely keeps on emphasizing that they walk keneged kapis ragleinu. Even when he mentions America in other parts of the book, he always mentions that they are walking on the opposite side of our feet, which is itself probably representative of how you were trying to convey it to your audience. Like, this is crazy. It's probably was blowing people's minds to think about it, to realize that that's the case. So one would have to explore that chapter to see if it touches on this nakuda that I think is the center, the focal point of the Alter Rebbe's presentation. But it's not clear. It's not clear if the Alter Rebbe, as far as I know, it's not clear if the Alter Rebbe saw it. He could have seen it. Was he keeping up to date with new Svarim? That's B'chala Shaili, even Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Was he keeping up with new Svarim, the Prima Gadim, certain Svarim from his era, that it's not fully clear if he saw them or how much he used them. The Alter Rebbe, it's hard to know what exactly his daily schedule was, but Lav Dafka, between all the Yonim he was involved in, Lav Dafka, he had time to sit and just read new books, read new Svarim. There were many Gedolim and different Tkufas that made it a point of pride that they don't keep up with the latest Svarim anymore. So you kind of just assume that the Alter Rebbe saw it. And again, I'm not sure if, especially since the Alter Rebbe seems to just mention Yesod Offer, and doesn't seem to mention any of the newer terminology, I don't know if it's necessary to say that Alter Rebbe was looking at it. On the other hand, you could say that maybe the Alter Rebbe was reacting to it. People were talking about it, and they said, Sefer Abris talks about it, and the Alter Rebbe wanted to make this point and hone this point. It's possible. I don't know if it's ever shaykh to confirm. Nuchem Greenwald, I don't think addressed this point, this possibility. So that's just, we have to leave that at that, but it's a possibility that it plays some role here in some sense, but also, like I mentioned, the Frierdiker Rebbe places it in this more negative context. So if that was how it was seen at the time as well, so perhaps that would also be a reason for the Alter Rebbe not to look at it. Even if you knew about it, it may have been seen as something that one should avoid looking at. Although we do know that the Alter Rebbe did have an interest in sciences and Chachmas in his own right, and that's its own fascinating discussion. Alter Rebbe's connection with a certain doctor who translated scientific knowledge, scientific works for the Alter Rebbe into Hebrew as well. So there is some of that going on even within the Alter Rebbe's own world, the Alter Rebbe's own circle, somewhere around that decade, somewhere around that time, towards the end of the Alter Rebbe's life. We know that did happen, that did occur. So that itself is its own interesting topic, worth its own discussion sometime. So that concludes, I think, the second part of the discussion, which is the Alter Rebbe and the science and what the Alter Rebbe is actually trying to say. But now for the third part of our discussion as to what the real subtext is, particularly for the Hayom Yom and for the rebbeim and for us. So first of all, in this Hayom Yom, what's the source of the Hayom Yom? The Rebbe was Mitzayin, as I mentioned. The Rebbe had a copy, and in the margins, he was Mitzayin, the source of most of the quotes, whenever they are proper quotes from a letter or a sikha. And many editions of the Hayom Yom in the last 30 years or so have included that information as well. And there's a nice tshura from someone by the name of Lubetsky that I always go back to, where they bring the pictures. They bring the picture of each Hayom Yom with the Rebbe's Ksav Yad and the margins with the makar, and then they are actually mefaneach the makar, and they cite the text, the fuller context for the paragraphs in the Hayom Yom. Often the fuller context is pretty helpful, and sometimes is mamash naged to the pshat, that you can't understand correct pshat in the Hayom Yom without seeing the larger context, because sometimes without the context, your Havana could be in Gans and Fakert, but that's another discussion. So for Yudal Tammuz, the Rebbe wrote in the margins, Le Shas, which is short for Lishneirsen, Choyl HaMoed Pesach Tzadek Gimel. And in the Lubetsky's Shura, they quote the letter Barichus, but of course, I'll also be looking at the source in the original letter. So we already see here that this is not just a quote straight from the Tzemach Tzedek. This is a quote from a letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe, Lishneirsen, which, as we shall see, is to the Rebbe himself. So this is a letter from the Rebbe, from the Frierdiker Rebbe to the Rebbe himself, which the Rebbe just writes Lishneirsen, from Tafresh Tzadek Gimel, from Nisan, that's 1933. So why was the Frierdiker Rebbe writing to the Rebbe about the Tzemach Tzedek Be'echad Medurashov? So this is what we need to dig into and excavate. But in order to understand why the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote that letter, we have to back up a bit further. As I was emphasizing, there wasn't much connection between the Jews in Eastern Europe, Chassidish Yidden at that time, the late 1700s, early 1800s, and America. It wasn't seen as a realistic place, or almost probably not seen as a real place. It's hard to imagine that it's a real place. So certainly not an option. People weren't thinking and considering moving there the way they would consider perhaps moving somewhere else, either permanently or to migrate, to visit, for business, for adventure. But as time went on, this is its own topic, the history of Jews in America, which I touched on before. With time, we start finding Jews of other stripes arriving in America as well. I personally can't say with certainty who the first Eastern European or sort of Hamish Fruma Yid to come here was. Recently I saw that I think in the 1850s, perhaps, there was someone by the name of Ben Zion Bernstein, who in English he went by Zion. Often you have to try to find the closest, most approximate English name that sounded like a normal name in English. So Ben Zion is not a name in English, so he went by Zion Bernstein, but his name is Ben Zion Bernstein, and his name is mentioned in newspapers describing the Jewish community in New York at that time, and I saw his Matzeva, so that's a candidate in my mind for one of the earlier Hamish Yidden. It seems he was from Poland. We know that a bit later, somewhere around between the 1850s and the 1870s, there was a trickle of Polish Yidden, and by Polish could include Russia as well. It's not often back then. Haredi Jews from Eastern Europe were known as Polish Jews generally. So from the 1850s to the 1870s, there was a bit of a trickle, and then from the 1870s and on, it was increasing exponentially every year until you get to the 1880s, 1890s, and then it's a real massive wave of immigration until the doors were shut about 100 years ago, in 1924, and that's when the doors were shut. There was a backlash to immigration. not that dissimilar in a number of ways to the environment we find ourselves in today. And to the extent you had Jews back then who also were opposed to further Jewish immigration, etc., etc. So we know, historically, we know first there were Western Sephardim, and then there were German Jews. The German Jews were the next wave, and they were mostly Reformed. And then the next wave was Eastern European Jews. Like I said, from the 1850s, it starts as a trickle, but already in Tofresh Yud's Taka, we find shuvas from the Baal Sher Lemeshev to the Yudel Middleman here in New York and to other Hamish Yidden. So they definitely were Hamish Yidden. And again, that's just the go-to word I'm going to use here. Hope no one's offended. So from the 1850s, certainly. And but the first Russian, the first Chabad, so we know there was a Schneerson, a distant Schneerson relative who was this big adventurous Shadar, and he arrived in America in the 1870s, and he was in the East Coast and the West Coast and all over the place. I don't know if we can fully count him as Chabad. At any rate, he didn't settle here. Otherwise, the first Chabad Kehillas, notable Chabad Shul or a notable Chabad person, the earliest Chabad Shuls are from that are confirmed are from the late 1880s, Tafresh Mems. So that's already after the Ptir of the Rebbe Marash. So that's pretty late in the scheme of things if you think about Chabad history. And the first notable Chassidim that are, so some of them are Avashem, Alter Chassid, is the beginning of the 1890s, the Tafresh Nuns, something like that. Recently I found a new mucker in the New York Times about the founding of perhaps the earliest Chabad Shul here in New York, in Manhattan. I don't have the information in front of me, the exact date, but I think it was around 1887, somewhere around there. Any earlier claim has not been substantiated. So that's pretty late. So within the Chabad world, America did not really become a reality, and Chassidim, certainly not Chassidim that we heard of, that we care about, we're not seriously considering traveling to America until the late 1880s, early 1890s, which is around the time the Rebbe Rashab fully assumes the Nesius. Now we know generally from the Tukuf of the Rebbe Rashab, it seems like he almost never agreed that anyone should travel to America. We know there was a big, strong stigma against traveling there, that's harmful beruchnius. It's often presented more as a practical zach, that for whatever the reasons were, Judaism, Hamish, from Yiddishkeit, struggled to take root in America for a very long time. Certainly in the earlier tkufas, it had something to do with the fact that there weren't really any serious rabbanim, chashuv rabbanim, but certainly there were problems beyond that. Then at some point you start having certain rabbanim that have a certain name or reputation who started arriving, and yet it still didn't immediately turn things around. I've seen there are some scholars who argue that Dafka, the immigration law of 1924, actually helped Yiddishkeit take stronger root in America. Why? Because the number of Rabbanim that had come until then, relative to the number of Jews, was still pretty low, pretty small. Once the doors were closed, you could only get into America under special conditions. Those who were rabbis actually had an advantage now. They were disproportionately likely to be able to receive admission to America. So suddenly the number of Rabbanim, the ratio of Rabbanim to Amcha started rising and rising and rising, so that itself could have helped contribute to help build a stronger infrastructure, which, along with other conditions, could have made it possible for Yiddishkeit to take stronger root in America. At any rate, this became only a serious, realistic question for some in the late 1880s, early 1890s. And at that time, the Rebbe Rashab generally was opposed to it, although there could be some exceptions or cases where he acknowledged that maybe others had made the decision themselves to go, and then he remained in touch. Now I'm remembering that in the presentation that I did in America a year or two ago, I'm trying to remember, there was the first letter. There's an interesting letter somewhere. The first letter of, I think it must be the Rebbe Rashab Taka. I have to go check, but I think there is a letter of the Rebbe Rashab. Finally, at some point, it's even later, maybe the 1900s or even as late as the 1910s, where the Rebbe Rashab finally writes a letter or responds to a letter and sort of acknowledges the Chabad Yishuv in America and says something about it. I'm pretty sure it's the Rebbe Rashab, and I regret that I didn't throw that source here together. I hadn't thought of it earlier. But that itself is like a very interesting and important source, an important detail. If you have to look at the chronology of Chabad's interaction with America, this is very important to understand and appreciate. You really have to wrap your mind around the fact of like how far off America seemed, whether begashmius or beruchnius, and how late this migration started. Now we have evidence that among people's conversations in Chabad about America, whether it's viable or it's not, there was this discussion about how the Alter Rebbe had once said that there wasn't Matan Torah in America. And some of you listening may already be thinking of the key words, the I don't know if the magical words, the golden words, but Chatzi Kader Atachtain is sort of the words that come to mind for that. As we'll see, not every discussion of this necessarily use those words, but in Chabad, Rebbe Rashab, I mean by the rebbeim, that those words became synonymous with this concept. But we find that in that door, there was this raid, there was this discussion. It wasn't clear to people. They didn't even know the clear source. But there was this talk, there was this raid, that the Alter Rebbe said something about how this Matan Torah wasn't Chatzi Kader Atachten. What exactly does that mean, and what are the ramifications? So it's interesting, it's been pointed out, that we actually have a sort of an outside source, a source that's not from, that's from Chabad, but not from Lubavitch, not from the rebbeim, and that is Reb Chaim Eliezer Buchovsky, who was chassid of Babroisk, I believe, certainly connected more to Kapis Liad Babroisk and less to Lubavitch. And we know at some point he had his run-ins with the Rebbe Rashab. He also was a pioneer in printing Chassidus, which the Igulim the Rebbe then sort of continued, the idea of printing all the ksavim of all the rebbeim. And he had his own ksavim, his own notes, his notebook, and at some point the Rebbe printed it, Kahas printed it with the shtempel, without the shtempel, whatever the story, the backstory to that is. But it's an interesting source because he was clearly a Chassidish yid full of yedias, and he writes very interesting things, but scattered throughout the Sefer, there are interesting Chassidish shmuas. It's maybe less than 5% of the content of the Sefer, and it's completely scattered throughout. And there hasn't been a proper likut. Someone I know, I don't know if he wants me to give him a shout out, but one of his many projects is that he's also done that. He's gone through the Sefer and identified the Chassidish shmuas. So I think maybe he was one who pointed out that there is something on this topic in Kisvei Reb Chaim Eliezer Buchovsky as well. Now, when I was, this actually brings back memories, because when I was in Zal and we were learning Gittin, so there's this idea, a few blot into Gittin, about how perhaps the Tchum of Eretz Yisrael extends westwards, sort of indefinitely into the ocean, and therefore land that's connected Eretz Yisrael might have a din Eretz Yisrael. So I remember somehow coming across at the time that Reb Chaim Eliezer Buchovsky has a shtickle there where he discusses this question, this possibility. Would that mean that if you keep going straight and you never stop, would that mean that parts of America, which are connected to Eretz Yisrael all the way across the Atlantic, would they have a din Eretz Yisrael? So this was intriguing me at the time, but I remember that I wanted to be ma'ayin in it or to write something up on it, and I think I sort of just hit a wall. I didn't have the tools and the skills at the time to develop the idea further. So that's earlier in the Sefer. Then later in the Sefer, he is mamshech. I guess it's later in his notebook, but he continues b'hamshech to what he wrote earlier. And so he quotes someone. It's not clear if we know who it is, but he quotes a certain Chassidish Rav that says that it wouldn't make sense that all the way to America would be part of Eretz Yisrael. Doesn't make sense. And then he adds himself, America, and here you see also this, he attests to the fact that the feed dimyon ha'olam, the way the world imagines it, the way the Welt, the way average Yid, even in his day, which is the late 18 and early 1900s, the way he imagined it is that America is tachas kapis ragleinu, they're sort of at the other end and like sort of upside down, and came batal klorayin zeh. So that if you frame it that way, if you view it, if you conceive of it that way, then it wouldn't make sense to say that that's part of Eretz Yisrael. It's like, it's literally the opposite side of the world. I didn't look up the Chavis Yor to see what the connection is, what the relevance is. And then he says, which is the same drush that we're talking about here. Binyan Beis HaMikdash Matan Torah Mitzvahs Kulon Ba'aretz Halos Dafka V'Loi Ba'aretz Ba'aretz Shalamata Himena. It says that the Beis HaMikdash Matan Torah Mitzvahs are all on this earth and not on the lower earths. V'yeshem mefarshim shebol lemait America. And there are those who teach that the Alter Rebbe means that you don't have to be mitzvah and turn mitzvahs in America. V'alkein hoitziu mishpat me'ukol she'asur l'nsoya la'America al pi das admur hazaken kisham le'nitna Torah. And therefore there was this chassidish raid that they were saying, here he says it the clearest. We would probably have to deduce this even without the source, but this source says it clearly, that the oilim was tining, that because the Alter Rebbe said this, that means the Alter Rebbe gehalten, that you can't go to America because the Torah wasn't given there. And that probably would have stemmed with what people were reporting, that the Torah is struggling to take hold in America. So we can say that, this is this weird netherworld, especially if you use this language of Tachas Kapis Ragleinu, Arotzu Shalamata. This is weird netherworld. The Torah wasn't given there. It's not humans and Yidden. It's not for us. We're not meant to go there. Tainet Bechovsky Avladaitu Yutos. He wants to tie it. Alter Rebbe was talking about America Bechlal. He was talking about you have to slice the globe a different way, and he goes on in that vein. But so maybe we'll get back to what exactly he's trying to tie in. But for now, we have this point that he's testifying, he's attesting. The oilam at getainet, that the Alter Rebbe had gesagt, the Matan Torah wasn't given ba'aratz shalamata, and therefore asur l'nsoya la'America pidas ha'marzaken kisham l'nitna Torah. This is a very helpful, valuable source because it confirms that this was the raid. And now suddenly we notice that there's discussion about this everywhere. So, for example, you look in the Rebbe Rashab's Igris, Chelik Aleph Igeres 56 asterisk, page 161, and it's a letter to Rebbe Yitzchak Chaim Doiv Ber Velensky, and they seem to omit parts of it, but the first paragraph, the first paragraph, he writes, B'chol Hamayra Pesach Ha'avar. This is they're assuming it's roughly the winter of Tafresh Nun Gimel, so late 1892 or early 1893, so pretty early on. And this is around when maybe the first Chassidim, again, that have a nomen al Chassid are going or considering going. It says, B'chol Moed Pesach Ha'avar, last Chol Moed Pesach, we were talking, you asked me that you heard B'shmi Shemavur B'kisvei Kodesh Asher Matan Torah Haya Al Chatzi Kadosh Shalonu B'loi B'America. You heard in my name that it says in Kisvei Kodesh in the Ksavim, meaning it's not just sometimes you have Shmuas that were transmitted as Zoi Balpeh from when the Alter Rebbe said it through oral channels. But here the Rebbe Rashab is saying it's through written channels. It says in Kisvei Kodesh, and Matan Torah is Haya Al Chatzi Kadosh Shalonu. It sounds like it wasn't known otherwise, but the Rebbe Rashab had the Ksavim, and he saw it in the Ksavim. So not clear what the gist of this paragraph is, meaning it continues and says, I showed you then. So why is he repeating this? Maybe Velensky forgot the details. He's asking the Rebbe Rashab to remind him. So the Rebbe Rashab is reminding him of their conversation. Then I told you this. Well, Adrabah, Sheshama B'Shmi. The Rebbe Rashab was on the record saying it. Velensky heard it, Sheshama B'Shmi, Shemavur B'Kisvei Kodesh. And then he asked the Rebbe Rashab directly. Zecher Tzad v'Kodesh Tovrach etc. B'Shnas Taf Samach Beis. V'Nimtza Etzli Sai B'Ksav Yad Kodesh Admar Hayom Tzai, and Sai in the other Ksav Yad of Reb Moshe, and Shnei Drushim of Chaka Azmur that's Tzemach Tzedek. So again, maybe the Rebbe Rashab was just reminding him of the details and the facts. So this itself, there's no further context here, at least that they printed. This itself would suggest. Bechovsky is saying, the Welt is saying that the Alter Rebbe said such and such. Where did the Welt hear about it from? Is it something that the Welt knew orally mizmanai shel Alter Rebbe, or was it something that was discovered in the Kisvei Kodesh? Bechovsky and the Rebbe Rashab are both being assigned to the same drush, Teila Eretz, which is, as we'll get to, this is the drush actually that we're talking about right now, and we have to get to that part of the drush. So when the Bechovsky says V'yeshem Afarshim Shebol Lamayit America, and the Rebbe Rashab says Sheshama B'Shmi Shemavur B'Kisvei Kodesh, we can't help but wonder whether that is actually the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab is the one who found it, perhaps, and the Rebbe Rashab is the one who's spreading word of it. Why is the Rebbe Rashab spreading word of it? Perhaps the Rebbe Rashab himself was telling people that Lefi the Alter Rebbe, you should not move to Chatzi Kadar Tachten. This is only speculative. I don't think we have any confirmation for this. But to me, it's not upgefrekt that this is something that the Rebbe Rashab may have Taka said. We know the Rebbe Rashab Taka was not in favor of moving to America. So it's not upgefrekt that the Rebbe Rashab was citing the Kisvei Kodesh, which he had access to cite this idea, which may not have been well known, that telling people the Alter Rebbe says this. The next source we have is a letter of the Frierdiker Rebbe. It's in his Igros Chelik Beis, a letter from, it's not clear, but we assume it's Tafresh Tzadik Aleph, 1931. It's Sigaris number 525, page 330. The letter to Madayevsky. And in the letter, he says, Echad Me'advarim, they're talking about the correspondence between the Rebbe Rashab and Wolanski, and that they were in touch in the early years, around up and through Tafresh Nun Gimel. That's the topic of this letter. And he says, one of the things that's supposed to be in the Rebbe Rashab's letters to Wolanski, who bir inyan hanisker bedach, shematan Torah haya b'chatzi kador halozeh, asher gilui HaTorah b'chatzi kador sheni, hu al yedei aveda acheres b'yisrin koyach dafka. Uklalas ha'inyan hu shematan Torah haya b'derach gilim l'mayla, v'amshachas HaTorah b'chatzi kador sheni hu al yedei aveda mesiras nefesh dafka. ובאחד המכתב מאלי כסף אשר זה שנם רבי שביר עניין זה במכתב וחשב אני אשר זהו להרב חיים דויבר. So here the Frierdiker Rebbe repeats it, and he's saying he's remembering something that the Rebbe Rashab wrote, and here already it's coming with a hesber that Alter Rebbe Taka said it, but pshat is nish, that it's clearly implicit that pshat is nish, that you shouldn't go to America. But Adarabba, America requires a special avodah, which is different than the Hamshachas HaTorah in the Chatzi Kador Elyon. It doesn't say Elyon and Tachten. Here it's Chatzi Kador Halozeh, Chatzi Kador Sheni. Here's the, if you want to trace the development of the terminology. The Rebbe Rashab also wrote, Chatzi Kador Shalonu v'loi b'Amerika. That's the terminology of the Rebbe Rashab. And the Frierdiker Rebbe, Chatzi Kador Halozeh and Chatzi Kador Sheni. I'm pointing this out because in Chabad, from the Rebbe and on, Chatzi Kador Tachten also just became like a stand-in for America. When the Rebbe would speak about the hashpah of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe in America, so the terminology, the standard terminology became Chatzi Kador Tachten. You even see it in like the Pesach Dovers to Mamarim, that marking the years since arriving in Chatzi Kador Tachten. So at some point, the term almost got severed from the original context, although you could argue that every time that term is being used, it is meant to call to mind the original context. So the Frierdiker Rebbe is saying that he remembers, so the Maisa, we have this letter to Rebbe Chaim Ber, and it doesn't seem to have any of that beer. It just says, you heard B'Shmi that Shteit Azoi, and I'm confirming that it's Shteit Azoi, which I said could be understood to be Alter Rebbe, taking the more literal taich. But the Frierdiker Rebbe says that he knows that the Rebbe Rashab was in touch with Chaim Ber. The Rebbe Rashab also once wrote to me in a letter that Asher Zeh Shanam Rabbeis Shabir Inyan Zeh Michtav. So V'choshev Ani Asher Zeh L'Reb Chaim Ber. I think it's to Reb Chaim Ber. So the Frierdiker Rebbe is sort of not saying it bevados, and it's a bit unresolved as to what the Rebbe Rashab wrote and when and to who, because we don't seem to have it. But the Frierdiker Rebbe is being meyachas this beer to the Rebbe Rashab. It's also possible, I think, to suggest that in light of the fact that the letter to the Rebbe Chaim does not seem to have this beer, that it could be that Rebbe Rashab originally maybe took it more literally, and then with time came to interpret it differently. At any rate, we have an edus in the Frierdiker Rebbe that the Rebbe Rashab himself, Taka, seems to have interpreted it differently, which is very nageya to our discussion here. So we have this shmua that people are talking about. Bechovsky says the Welt is talking, and some are saying Mishem Alter Rebbe, you're not allowed to go. And then we have the Frierdiker Rebbe saying Mishem Rebbe Rashab, that is a primistic taich. So they'll go back here and emphasize this vart, this idea, is from this same mimer or this same Torah or Imberois of Labanov of the Alter Rebbe. If you look in Tafkuf Samach Beis, Chelik Beis, where you have the two versions, the Mittel Rebbe's and the Reb Moshe's. So if you look at the Mittel Rebbe's, which begins Teila Eretz Al Blima, so it actually doesn't mention America at the beginning. It just mentions the question more generally of Inyan Amidas Kader Aretz America's Igul Hashemayim, Letipul Hashem Tzad, and Im Ben Adam de Milamata, Mekaneged Raglan Nefel Lamata, Etzla Manachna Lamata. So in this whole hezbollah of Igulim and Yosher, So there's this big emphasis on Igulim, and that's also the element that's emphasized in the Hayom Yom. But if you look in the original, the Alter Rebbe is actually saying sort of two things, that there's Igulim and Yosher together. Because ultimately, if you take the earth, you can't escape the sort of basic assumption that there is some kind of top and there is some kind of bottom. On the other hand, there's like this larger system in which everything is Igulim and everything is sort of equally relative to each other. I'm not going to claim here to get to the exact bottom of the Nakud and Agdara, but that's broadly what the Alter Rebbe seems to be saying, is sort of balancing both. So if you look towards, closer to the end, middle or towards the end of page Taf Ayin Vav, so you'll see there that he says, after he explains the Igulim, Af Avabi She'igul Kadar Artis Lefianal, Hu Shebechinos Igulim, Avol Gufe Shalakadar Bechol Oivyoy, Hu Bechinas Hayosher, Sheyitachen By Hamayel Lomata Dafka. So, on the one hand, there's this state of Igulim. On the other hand, if you examine the globe, the earth itself, there is a Mayelomata. And therefore, and here's where the key line appears. Vakeim binyan beis hamikdash umatan Torah umitzves kulan ba'aretz halaz dafka v'loy ba'arotzes shalamata himana. Here the Alter Rebbe said, "Klar beis hamikdash matan Torah mitzvahs are all of this earth and not in the lower earths," which itself is a interesting lashon of arotzes shalamata himana, which fits with sort of the way I was conveying and describing it earlier. Ki hi bechinas ma'ila ve'en lamata, because it is above and they are below. So there is Yosher going on, and he says Igulim would suggest that everything would be equal, but every part of the earth is different and has its own unique, whether it's the ecosystem or whatever term you want to use. But there is a lot of difference and distinction, and that itself is sort of Yosher terminology. So the earth is sort of Yosher, but the Igul HaShemayim is sort of Be'igul, and everything is the same relative to the Igul HaShemayim. So he seems to be trying to have both at the same time. And within that model, the Maya Lamata really kicks in when you talk about actual distinctions in the types of places, and therefore Matan Torah could be in the top half and not in the bottom half. And he says, spells interestingly, but that's where America is mentioned, talking about Mitzvah Rebbe as well. So the people across from our feet, which is this term that keep on using, they're Lamaila relative to the center of the globe, and we're also Lamaila relative to the center of the globe. And that could also be using Yosher and Ma'alamata terminology. There is Ma'alamata in the Gufishal Kador, and we're all Lamaila relative to the center. And that's the Taich Toila Aretz. On the one hand, there's like the Igul Kadar Aretz and Toila Aretz Al Blima, and that's the Igulim. But Gufashal Aretz, that's Yosher, it has the Ma'alomata, and so therefore both are true at the same time. And then there's also another paragraph about the weather, which is another topic. In Ramesh's Hanacha, it's two separate discussions. And if you look at Ramesh's Lahavin Kuchas HaTeichen, which is the one that Tzemach Tzedek was quoting, which is the one that the Rebbe and the Rebbe and Hayom Yom are quoting, which begins with America mentioned at the beginning. Although actually it looks like in Ramesh's version it doesn't mention America. It looks like when the Tzemach Tzedek copied it somewhere, maybe the Tzemach Tzedek added the word by America, maybe because the Tzemach Tzedek knew that the Alter Rebbe did mention the word. I don't know, it's interesting. What did the Alter Rebbe say America or not? It seems pretty clearly that the Alter Rebbe was talking about America, and the Mitzvah Rebbe and Tzemach Tzedek both mentioned the word America, so we're going to assume that the word was mentioned in this context. So in Lahavin Kuchas HaTeichnem, in his version, his presentation, it seems to really only focus on the Igulim for most of it. And then all the way towards the end, very big Kitzur says, V'af shebekam yesh bechinas makim shebechinas ma'ilo mata. Again, our experience on the planet Earth, of course, is Ma'ila Mata in different ways. And that's the terminology of Ma'ila Mata, and the terminology of Yosher, and the terminology of Ischalkos. Those are all synonymous. And of course, we experience Ma'ila Mata. So this whole Igulim thing has to work and fit with that at the same time. So we do experience Makim and Ma'ila Mata, but we're Makabel Shafim Elamayla, B'chinas Igulim Shalamayla. So there's sort of like this overriding status of Igulim at the same time that we also experience Yosher more individually. And then it concludes, Ach kafi b'chinas yoisha shu badragas ma'ilo matar reish v'soif etzleinu hu ha'ma'ilo. We're on the top. Ki etzleinu nisgal leikos yoiser v'hu binyan beis hamikdash v'kabal satayra v'eretz Yisrael. And it says, Ki azayin arotzes chulu artseinu hi ma'ila v'oisan lamata kafi b'chinas yoisha v'dal v'doy ketem. This is actually very intriguing, because it actually uses the term Zayin Aratzis. And Zayin Aratzis seems to be terminology that relates to this idea of netherworlds. And there, the pshat was, there was this notion that if you peel beneath the earth, you'll find other earths and other creatures and living things. And here, in Ramesh's version of it, it seems to say that the Zayin Aratzis relates to this, and Artseinu Himayala v'Oisan Lamata, although Zayin Aratzis, you would also more, I guess, standardly maybe think of 7 continents, but I don't think historically, classically, there were 7 continents. So it seems to be merging the idea of netherworlds with a more modern notion of continents, and it's saying that the world where Etzleinu, where Eretz Yisrael is, that's the normal world, and the netherworld is Taka on the other side of the world, and in some senses it's a netherworld, and in some senses it's all the same. So if you look at the full Ma'amar of Alter Rebbe, you see that there's, first of all, there's 2 sides to the beer. There's Igulim and there's Yosher. And in the Yosher part, Adrab, it says that we have a likus and the Mata doesn't. And a simple reading of the way the Alter Rebbe and Ramesha wrote it down, Taka does sound more like it's saying that we should remain here where we are, and those places are netherworlds. And Bachovsky coming and saying that he thinks that it suddenly doesn't mean America and it means south, the southern hemisphere, which you could sort of, if you want to cut the world up into neat halves, you could either do the old world and the new world, or northern and southern. But based on the whole context, especially if the Alter Rebbe mentioned America, assuming that we're working with the same notion and concept of the globe, and New York is in the northern hemisphere, the whole North America is in the northern hemisphere, so the Alter Rebbe isn't talking about the southern hemisphere, he's talking about the New World. So the simple reading, Taka, would be that it's a negative statement. So that was the source of this shmua that Bachovsky says. People said it's usher to go to America. It's all coming from this same Torah. So this Torah, for a while, for a certain tkufa, was known to be the anti-America Torah. Why? Because of the Seifa. However, so that's also very important to understand. So that's, and from the Rebbe Shabbat, it's not clear from what he wrote in Tov Reish Nun Gimel how he took it, how he understood it. So now things are moving, things are happening, more and more Jews are heading to America, and by Tov Reish Tzadik, the Rebbe Shabbat himself, the Rebbe himself visited America, and there's this question about moving to America, but as we'll see later, there must have been just this very large psychological barrier that crossing to America was some kind of spiritual demotion, spiritual defeat. It wasn't like moving from Russia to some other land, which could also be unpleasant and uncomfortable, and it's not your homeland, and you have ties to the land. There was something fundamentally different in the popular conception, something that we don't realize today anymore, I don't think. But back then, it would have been very widespread and very relatable. People would have seen, and the Rebbe and others would have seen America as sort of this netherworld. It's a different place. It's not, doesn't have Jewish history. It's not related to the history of Matan Torah. Obviously, when we think of world history, it's not just a very abstract idea, and it's not just physics, and it's sort of in the popular historical conception. When we think of Jewish history, we think of it all taking place on the Chatzi Kader Hazeh Ha'elyon, and America isn't part of the picture for all that history. So it is just this foreign place that also is inhabitable, but it's like almost like going to Mars. It's like almost, if I went to Mars, my attitude of the Shiloh was Matan Torah given here. It's so different. So going to America back then felt like going to the moon, felt like going to Mars. It felt like you're going to almost like a different Earth, another world. Zayin Aratzis, our Eretz Talamata. So this was clearly on people's minds, and Rebbe Shab is talking to Walensky about it in Tov Reish Nun Gimel or so. I feel like Rebbe is bringing it up again around Tov Reish Tzadik Aleph, and then comes Taka the letter, which is the source of the Hayom Yom, which is to the Rebbe himself, and this was printed in a number of places. It was printed in, I think, the Hisafis 2, Sefer Mamorim Tafshin Ches. Then it was printed in Ignis of Fidik Rebbe Chelik Beis, letter number 617, page 492. And then again, when they printed the correspondence between the Fidik Rebbe and the Rebbetzin in Chelik Tezvav, they printed it again. Not immediately clear to me what the significant difference is and why they saw the need to do this, if there's no Chelik and no Hisafa, unless I'm missing something. But maybe they wanted it to be a Davar Shalim, the full correspondence, so they included it again. So it's also letter number 5502, page 137 onward. And the letter begins, Chasni Yakiri V'chavivi Harav, Ramam Sheyichye Shalom U'bracha. Meinal Shelas Chalimor, Shamati Oimrim B'Shem, Chak Rabbeinu Agadol, Zeichen Tzaddik Moshe Vrach, etc. Asher B'Amerika Lehoya Matan Torah, V'Mefsher V'Akosha Levarli. So that means that as late as 1933, the Welt is still not much has changed from the 1890s to the 1930s. The Igulim is still saying that the Alter Rebbe said there's no Matan Torah in America, and it's implied, even without stating it clearly, like Bachovsky, it's implied that that's a negative point with regard to America. And the Fidik Rebbe begins and says, Tshuva, Hashmua sheshamata b'shem hoit chak Rabbeinu Agadol, etc. Oidus America b'yachas la'gil Matan Torah nechoinehi. Aminam haloshin shata kais v'asher, quote, ba'Amerika lehoya Matan Torah, end quote, mishul b'shu, va'avar lecho ha'inyan al sidroi. And then the Fidik Rebbe starts giving larger background, but right off the bat, right at the beginning, the Fidik Rebbe says, that language already, you got to be very careful, not ba'Amerika lehoya Matan Torah, which would imply either it means that you're not mechuyev in Torah mitzvahs. I don't know if anyone fully considered that possibility of pshat, or just means that it's not a place for Yidden. You can't go there. And Matan Torah wasn't there, so there's no likus there. That's how it seems to be stated in the source. That there's Gilui likus is only in the Chatzi Kader Hazeh, not the Lamata. Although once again, disclaimer, in the original it says Eretz Hazeh and Eretz Shalamata, not Chatzi Kader. That sort of developed with time. So you see that the Fidik Rebbe was immediately leaping to sort of clarify and to set the tone that we are all familiar with. So Fidik Rebbe alluded to it in that more personal letter from Tzadik Aleph, and here in Tzadik Gimel, the Fidik Rebbe lays down this mahalach of how we are to understand what the Alter Rebbe said. The Fidik Rebbe gives a whole background, which we're not going to look at right now, and it concludes, Ubishnas Tovkuf Samach Beis, when he came back from Petersburg the second time to Liadi, he had a Seder, and to be bekvius in his home on Yom Gimel, to sit with the family. The Fidik Rebbe is also sort of giving this context that there's like this genre attack of Lahavins, and it's Emreis of Labanov. They're all Emreis of Labanov, which contributes to the larger point I made earlier about that there's this standalone genre. The Fidik Rebbe is also acknowledging it. So that was all by way of background to understand what this text even is. Now, V'ini b'sefer ha'nochas t'shnas t'chasam beis of the Alter Rebbe and his brother Rav Moshe Harav Atzadik Rav Moshe Zech Atzadik V'chadosh Lavracha by the Rebbe Rashab. He doesn't mention his name. He writes Chaf Yud Kuf Hey, and that's like the code term for Rav Moshe. The Fidik Rebbe, as we know, sort of reclaimed Rav Moshe, Rav Atzadik Rav Moshe. So Nimtzu Drush Echad Maschel Oven Kushas HaToichnim. And the Tzemach Tzedek quotes it in his Drush, Dibra Maschel Neitet Sofen Al Toyu. And here is the Fidik Rebbe quoting the Tzemach Tzedek, quoting Rav Moshe's version of the Alter Rebbe, and as we pointed out earlier, Rav Moshe's original text is missing the word b'Amerika, the Tzemach Tzedek put it back in. But Rabbeinu Zal b'Emreis of Labanov, Yom Gimel Parshas Balak Shnas Taf Samach Beis, Amar V'Zed Dvarav, L'Oven Kushas HaToichnim. And here it quotes the sort of the kash a little bit more by Arichos. Then the Fidik Rebbe writes, "Mevi l'shayna sefer nechmod v'noim shar shlishi siman hey," and that's taka only in the Tzemach Tzedek's version. The Tzemach Tzedek often would find minor makaymis from classical Jewish works. So he taka inserts v'ayin b'sefer nechmod v'noim shar shlishi siman hey ech sheruvim v'shimon yamdu mishnei evrov shel kader haaretz zem imal loy v'zem mitachas loy v'shkol echad mehem yamim v'kem b'skufa reish l'mal reish l'ragel l'mata. So that's also a classical Jewish work that doesn't mention America per se, but mentions this question, mentions this problem. And the Tzemach Tzedek actually goes on to quote and paraphrase a bit from the Sefer Nechum B'Noim with the question and the answer. And actually, the way the answer is given in Nechum B'Noim actually sort of can muddy up a bit my framework, my presentation in the previous section of our discussion as to what the Havamina was, what the Maskana was, because the Nechum B'Noim's answer seems sort of similar to how I explained the Alter Rebbe's answer, and yet the Tzemach Tzedek quotes it and then continues v'hatira tzamitihu. So I think this has come up in previous debates, but I still stick to my interpretation of what the Alter Rebbe meant, and how the insertion of the Nechum B'Noim fits in here, and what the Tzemach Tzedek means needs to be discussed, and maybe it's v'doichek tzas, but I still think that you could say that the Nechum B'Noim just made the point generally without the Kabbalistic terminology, and the Tiras Hamitihu is that you need the Kabbalistic terminology to properly understand. What do you mean there's no top, there's no bottom? There is a top and a bottom. Just saying that it isn't, how does that make it so? Tiras Hamitihu, you need the Kabbalah to explain why this is true. But the Nechum B'Noim itself also, its main point seemed to be this point, that you have to realize that there's no top, there's no bottom, we're all equally top and bottom to each other. I guess I should have mentioned it earlier if I would have had it Masudar, but I'm mentioning it now. But so the Tzemach Tzedek Taka mentions the Nechum B'Noim, inserts that as an earlier source that he found. He does not mention a Sefer Abris or anything like that. So that perhaps is a data point on that count. Back to the Fidik Rebbe's letter to the Rebbe. So there's the question, there's the Nechum B'Noim, Rabbeinu Zal Amar, Ki Atidus Amitihu, V'yinim V'or Eitz Chaim, etc. And here the Fidik Rebbe condenses it, brings the Igulim part Bekitzer, and immediately brings also the Yosher part Bekitzer. Ach kafi b'chinas Yosher, shehu ba'draga ma'ila matresh v'soy v'etzleinu hu ha'ma'ila, ki etzleinu nigla likus Yosher, shri Eitz Yisrael v'asik kedushas b'semikdash kabos ha'torah etzleinu. And the Fidik Rebbe is quoting both parts, and then the Fidik Rebbe continues and says, Hadrush hu makar ha'shmua ha'amur b'mechtavcha. This latter part is the source of the very source of the very shmua that you are repeating in your letter. Dvarim brudim she'in dorshim bir klal, that in Igulim there's no ma'ilomata, only in Yosher there is ma'ilomata, and of course we see that there's Eitz Yisrael, there's chutz la'aretz, kol shekein, so there's obviously ma'ilomata. So kol shekein, there has to be a difference between the two halves of the globe. The anisbus b'makim, akira v'aricha kumayla b'chesarin, so whatever's close to Eitz Yisrael is greater, whatever's further is the opposite. So the Alter Rebbe's model has to account for that. So there's both the Igulim and the Yosher. Then the Fidik Rebbe seizes on a Hisafa that Tzemach Tzedek added, that's K'may Ikra Shras and Hashamu B'mayach. I'm going to be Mekatze here, but the Fidik Rebbe fears ice there and says, so v'cheinu b'inyan ha'aratzis, the Malay Klaretz K'voidoi b'shnei chatzoya kedurim b'shav. Of course, it's both halves equally. Al shechatzi zeh asher b'shitchei hu Eretz Yisrael, as the Kedushas, Makam Mikdash, but the half that has all these things is greater. Obviously, you have to say that it's shaykh to the whole world. And the Medrash says that when Hashem said, Hashem Malikacha, the whole world trembled, and if it trembled, and he fears ice there, so he brings the Medrash, the Tzipor, and the Oif, and the Shur, and the Ifanim, and the Serafim. He can't be mechalik between the two halves. It's just the degrees of Gilui. So that's the Fidik Rebbe's argument, Taka, there, directly responds to the Rebbe. Here he doesn't say B'Shem the Rebbe Rashab and Bolansky. I don't know if the Fidik Rebbe reconsidered as to whether the Rebbe Rashab wrote it or not. I don't know. But here he says that the Zoya is like, if you look in the Makar, look in the Pshat, you're ma'ayin in the pshat, this is the pshat you have to arrive at, and it's meduyik and different lashonos, and that itself could be its own discussion, to be ma'ayin in the lashonos and to ma'ayin the Fidik Rebbe's beer, and we can have a whole dion and a pilpul about that, but for now we're taking it at face value. The Fidik Rebbe is tining and arguing. There's also l'chayra chilik perhaps between the nuschos. In the Mittel Rebbe's nusach, it's Matan Torah. In the Ramesh's nusach, it's Kabbalah HaTorah. And that's the nusach that the Fidik Rebbe quotes as well, the Lashon Kabbalah HaTorah. So it could be that also sort of contributes to the Taina that, of course, Matan Torah was everywhere. That maybe there's a chiluk in Kabbalah HaTorah. I don't know, it's not mefurish in the Fidik Rebbe's words. The Fidik Rebbe doesn't seem to fully address and acknowledge the fact that Kabbalah Torah itself is also mentioned in the Makar. In his presentation, it's like, oh, the Eretz Yisrael, the Eretz HaKadosh, Makom HaMikdash. So there's still room to, like I said, there's still room to be done what exactly the Frierdiker Rebbe is saying and how he's teaching it. But in his lashon, he's differentiating. In his words, he differentiates between Maimed Har Sinai versus Gila Matan Torah. The top half has Eretz Yisrael, Eretz HaKadosh, Makom HaMikdash, Maimed Har Sinai, but the Gili Matan Torah was everywhere. So that's how the Frierdiker Rebbe says it here. And then you have the additional vart, which is not explicit here, but is in that previous letter, where the Frierdiker Rebbe attributes to Rebbe Rashab. There's this idea that Adrabah, the Dafka, the Chatzi Kader Atachten, requires an Avodah Acheres, B'Yisr and Koyach Dafka. So it's interesting, B'chalal, to compare the two letters of the Frierdiker Rebbe, because they cover different ground and approach it differently. But these are the two things the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote about it, and the Iker one is what he wrote to the Rebbe Taka. And it is from that letter that the Rebbe chose to excerpt this paragraph. But what's fascinating is if you realize that the whole context of the letter was about the Shmuel about Matan Torah. And that was the question, and that was the Oisfir. On the path to explaining where that Shmuel comes from, where the original quote is, the Frierdiker Rebbe quoted the beginning of the Maimer, and you're seeing that the Rebbe is choosing of that entire letter to completely omit the kasha and the teretz, and only to quote the lashon about America, and including the word America, which is something included. So the Rebbe seems to be turning this whole letter, this whole discussion, which came from a sort of a negative context, a negative connotation about America, and the Rebbe is turning it into a positive thing. Here, look, the Tzemach Tzedek quotes from the Alter Rebbe, that the Alter Rebbe once spoke about America. And I think this is not coincidental, and it's not, the Rebbe didn't want to get into that topic, but here's another interesting topic, let's quote this. I think it is somewhat bedafka. I saw someone wrote Al Derech HaTzachos, that maybe the Rebbe was also mechaven that the Hayom Yom is in the whereabouts of July 4th, so it's also a time to think about or talk about America. I don't know if that's pshat. Well, there's another important source that's not very well known, and that is the Sefer Sichos of the Frierdiker Rebbe right after he came to America, Kayetz Hey Shin Tov Hey Tov Shin, and this is in Shavuos, page 119, 120. And this is what the Frierdiker Rebbe says. When es is nachat geworden, as mir bedarfen fahren nachher in America, habe ich viel übergelebt. Once we made the decision, we're coming here, I experienced a lot, not in a good sense. Es ist mir bitter schwer gewesen, der wegfahren von der Golus Medina Russland, und ich habe viel übergelebt dann, und befragt, wegfahren in der kalter Gashmistiker America. So the Frierdiker Rebbe found it very troubling, Taka, that we're leaving, we have to leave Russia and come to America. In mein Arbeitsmachshavas Belevish habe sich allein Menachem gewöhnt mit der Hoffnung, als ich will, bei Ezer Hashem, während ben Shishim, wird mir Hashem Yisborach bei Glicken mit Chayim Menucha. Aber der Atzas Hashem Yisborach hat mich Beiche gewöhnt, machen mein Golas heim in Amerika, und ich soll sein, der Schlich Leheva, bringen dem Messias Nefesh auf Teretz Mima, was heute, der Rebbe Rashab, hat den Amshach gewöhnt, und ich in America. Frierdiker Rebbe says, in my Abbas Machshavas, the way I imagined my life going, I thought that at 60 I can rest. But that's the Abbas Machshavas. That Sas Hashem, instead, is shoving me here to America, to be the Shliach, to be Messias Nefesh here. The Frierdiker Rebbe, in his way, in his language, is conveying that it was taka an upsetting thought. The very notion that he had to come to America, as I alluded to before, was upsetting. It was something that was hard to swallow. It didn't sit right. And then the Frierdiker Rebbe continues and says, "This is you do it. Then Mayim was Rabbeinu Azak not gesagt, and you're talking of Samach Beis. After passing, let it soften all to you. Tell it it's Ablima. As the Gili from Matan Torah was this B'chatzi Kader Haaretz Hasheni is Helem Lagabe dem Gilui Matan Torah was is Geben in dem Chatzi Kader Haaretz was is Eretz Yisrael and Ala Medinas who Yidden Levin." So here, first of all, you see the Frierdiker Rebbe sort of summarize and sort of inject a little bit of that taich that the Gilui Matan Torah is Behelem Lagabe, as opposed to saying the way the Welt understood it. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says, "Ich bin sicher, as der was weiß dem Seder Chai Yisrael Medinas Russia Polen Bechlal und dem Chai Hasidim befrat und Chai heute Chakra Vesino Besino Hakdoshin Messiach Ad Frati Protius versteht mit was für ein zerbrochener Herz ich hab I've aufgenommen die Golas American Nasiya. So Friedrich says, if you know anything about anything, you'll know how Tzabrachen I would be. The Aseres Mei Nasiya from the Riga came to New York, and Mein Aseres Mei Tshuva. He says the 10 days of the travel were like Aseres Mei Tshuva for me. And I had to think about the Seder Achayim and this new Shlichus art. So here's talking the letter that I mentioned before. I forgot that the Friedrich Rebbe quotes it. So the Friedrich Rebbe says, I have a letter that the Rebbe Rashab Taka wrote to Avram Chaim Rosenbaum to the Chassidic Chabad in America, Chavdal Adarisha and Tafish Samach Beis. And it's an interesting letter. The language of the Rebbe Rashab there is interesting, and it's copied and pasted here, Taka, into Sefer HaSichos. Different Lashonis there. We're not going to get into that whole letter now. We're already been Meirich. The Friedrich Rebbe says, this is Ibrik, after he quotes it, he concludes, this is Ibrik, zu sagen, was fahre his Eires Pnimis der Brief mit die Dividik Kodesh HaKadoshim haben auf mir gemacht, als es hat in mir Eire gewähnt, Koiches Pnimiem, auf Limser Nafshi bepeil, in der Avoide von Arbotzes Teure, wie der Rotzen von Hoyt Chag HaAmur HaKadosh is, gleich wie ich willkommen in America, and with that the Sikha concludes. So what we see here is that the Friedrich Rebbe is traveling to America, and the stigma hasn't gone away. And we know the Friedrich Rebbe considered it earlier when he came the first time, but in addition to all the other practical concerns, it seems like there's like a fundamental, like it was problematic, it was disturbing, Taka to come to America. And in that light, the Friedrich Rebbe was sort of reviewing what the rebbeim have to say about America. And he quotes Sai the Alter Rebbe and Sai the Rebbe Rashab. Now, technically, in the presentation, the Alter Rebbe is quoted more as like to contribute to the negative, that the Alter Rebbe said that it's behelim, and so therefore he was tzibrochen. Then he quotes Rebbe Rashab and says, and that gave him the chayas. So it seems like the Rebbe Rashab's letter was more directly a positive effort, but Ulei Shloimar, that even though it's not stated explicitly, but the fact that the Alter Rebbe also spoke about America. And perhaps Dafka, the first half compared to the second half, the fact that the Alter Rebbe is sitting in Tafkuf Samach Beis and talking about America is also sort of a positive thing. And that's, I think, certainly would seem to be the Rebbe's interpretation of it, and the Rebbe's choice to include it in Hayom Yom is sort of seeking to take this source that was seen as so negative, and Bechavsky and the Rebbe Rashab and the Friedrich Rebbe, and the Friedrich Rebbe discussing it 3 different times, and Tak and Tzadik Aleph is a more positive take on it. But interestingly, it doesn't get mentioned again in Tzadik Gimel and Tafshin. But Taka to take something like that and to say that even the Matan Torah part is also a positive challenge, it's not a negative thing. And that's how the Rebbe himself, of course, continued to take it. And I haven't gone back now and gone through all the places where the Rebbe talks about Chatzi Kader Tachten, but to the Rebbe it almost became like, the fact that the Rebbe took that line, not just the beginning in the Hayom Yom, but later took the Chatzi Kader Tachten and turned that into a positive, that itself, you have to understand that the Rebbe is doing something there. It's not, it's never a pashut line. The very fact that Yiddishkeit has a kiyum here in America in this historical context is itself, it's almost like hapech hateva, and the Rebbe keeps on referring to the fact that to accomplish in Chatzi Kader Tachten is a nishtam. It's not the same as accomplishing in Chatzi Kader Elyon, as the terms came to become the standard terms, Chatzi Kader Tachten. So again, to say the fact that the Alter Rebbe was talking about and thinking about it, maybe that's my interpretation. Maybe the Rebbe doesn't say it clearly, but I think that itself tells us something and shows us that even at the beginning, the Alter Rebbe had America on his mind. He was thinking about America. Interestingly, I also have here that there's another mimer from Tafkuf Samachay. I don't have a Dibra Maschel here, but there's 2 Hanachas also, Ramesh and Alter Rebbe. Maybe this is Ramesh's, and in that one as well, suddenly in the middle it mentions this Nakuda of Igulim, K'may Aretz Gashmi, Kader Igul Katapuach, שאין נמצא בו בכינס מייל ומטה כלל, פירוש שבני אדם הישם על הארץ נתבל להם שם למיילה, אשר בני אדם מדרם לנגדם תחתיהם ממש כבר החודש אמריקה, הם עמדו ברגליהם למיילה ופניהם למטה, והיו מצטרכים ליפו לגמרי. And here also that sort of articulates what I was saying, that you would think that their feet are up and their head is down. אך באמס, בני אדם שלמטה נדבה שהם למיילה, ואלה למטה, ובאמס כחו ששניהם למיילה. Of course, it's over Kaduri, Igulim. So this Nakuda was mentioned again, apparently in Tafkuf Samachay. And I think in Ramesh's Hanacha it's sort of mashlim and mentions Ba'olam HaChadosh America. So it's mashlim to talk of Samach Beis. The author mentioned it more than once, according to this. Mittler Rebbe also mentions America in some places in his Torah in interesting ways, which I don't have in front of me right now, not so directly negated to our discussion. Tzemach Tzedek was Isaac in it and copied it, and like I said, it seems like he put the word America into Ramesh's Hanachim Takus Beis. So I think that also sort of expresses that even though there was a bit of a negative tinge to the way the Alter Rebbe said B'Shaitoi, but it was in hindsight we have to see it as a positive form of engagement, even in the part about Matan Torah itself. But Kolshkein, I think the fact that the Rebbe chose to include it and chose to include that first part, I think highlights that you see, the Alter Rebbe spoke about America, so we're here in America. This was part of the Alter Rebbe's framework. It's not like B'chal, everything in Chassidus Chabad sort of is supposed to date back, it's supposed to stem from the Alter Rebbe. So the Alter Rebbe never spoke about America. It would be schwer almost to how do we digest America. But here you see the Alter Rebbe did speak about it. He did explain how it fits in, and in this kata taka, it's all b'shaveh. Taka is also a musik of yesher, but in this kata, which the Rebbe chooses to include, it emphasizes that it's all beigel, it's all b'shaveh. So in that sense, it's all the same. Also, perhaps it's a chizuk that America is nicht anders. America could be the same as the Chatzi Kader Alien. And that also gives you context to the Frierdiker Rebbe saying, so it's not just a sociological observation, but also a spiritual observation that the Frierdiker Rebbe believed that America is nicht anders, even Beruchnis Hanyonim. So I think that provides a lot more context to what's happening here in the Hayom Yom and what, like I said, is happening between the lines and what's omitted and what the Rebbe chose to include. And therefore, like I said, I think the Nakuda, if you have to summarize the Hayom Yom in one word, the Hayom Yom is not about gravity. The Hayom Yom is about America and the Yachas of the rebbeim to America, back from when America was this far-off, strange place, through the Frierdiker Rebbe having to cross the ocean, a serious tshuva, 10 days of agony, of being tzebrachin, coming to America, and deriving chizuk from the words of the rebbeim about the connection to America, and the Rebbe choosing to highlight this passage and include it in today's Hayom Yom.